Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome once again to the Prancing Pony Podcast, where the good stuff is good enough for the halls of the Elven King.
Westu Hall, my friends. I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark. And as always, I'm joined by the man of the West, the Aragorn to my Éomer, Alan Sisto.
Thanks, Sean. You know, it was nice being Tulkas for a while. Less said about Legolas, though, the better. But I'm glad to be back as the mysterious vagabond with
the hair. It's all the hair, Alan.
It's all the...
Sorry.
I don't have any hair left, Sean. But I do like being the mysterious vagabond because I've got that rascally look going on.
Yes, you do.
Unfortunately, I'm a little shorter, but that's all right. Well, folks, since the moon recently showed up, we are going to make one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, because mankind is finally showing up. The Second Children of Ilúvatar are finally awakening in Chapter 12 of Men.
Very well done. Have you ever noticed this is actually the shortest chapter title in the whole Silmarillion? It's 5 letters and a space.
Wow, you're not kidding. That might actually make it the shortest chapter title in the Legendarium.
Probably.
There are other ones that are one word, like Lothlorien, or there's a couple others, but I don't 5 characters plus a space.
He wasn't the kind for like really short chapter names like War or Death.
No, not really. And of course, it turns out to be one of the shortest. Sam. There would have been a chapter name for you. Probably about the only way you can get shorter. Sam. Good stuff. Man. Well, fortunately, it's also one of the shortest chapters in length, too.
That is true.
I'm sitting here thinking, how are we going to get a whole, hour and a half out of this? But, you know us.
I'm sure we'll still find a way, right?
The Prancing Pony Podcast method.
Prancing Pony Podcast way.
Well, if there's one thing we do well, it is find a way to say way too much.
That is very true.
But first, before we dig into the chapter, does old Bartleman have anything in his bag for us tonight?
He does, actually, Alan. We've got a question from our old friend Maya in Michigan.
Okay.
And I want your take on this one, so I'm going to let you answer it first. But I also have some thoughts, so I'll pitch it to you, and then you can hand it back.
Sounds good.
So Maya wrote in saying, Tolkien himself described the Ainur as angelic beings. Judeo-Christian mythology portrays angels as warriors of God. Do you think the Ainur of Tolkien's universe could be seen meeting this description? Certainly, I feel Olorin could over his involvement in the Third Age. I feel the other Ainur do as well. Additionally, Judeo-Christian mythology describes 7 ruling angels. This is interesting. 7 ruling angels known as archangels that are more powerful than the others. Lucifer is the 7th archangel, much like Morgoth was a Vala. Basically, I'm asking 2 things. Do you feel Tolkien's Ainur live up to the warriors of God status of their biblical counterparts? And second, if the Maiar are the angels of Tolkien's world, could the Valar be equivalent to the archangels?
Well, those are definitely interesting questions, Maya. There's no doubt the Ainur have some parallels with the Judeo-Christian tradition of angelic beings. In that they are created beings. They are beings that don't have a physical, or they don't have to have a physical presence. They clothe themselves, but they don't have physical bodies. But I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say that angels are portrayed in the Judeo-Christian tradition as warriors of God. I mean, let me back that up. Don't get me wrong; they are portrayed as that from time to time. But when I think of angels in the Bible, the roles they fill are a lot broader. But first, you got to look at the word itself. Angels, that comes from the Greek angelos, which means messenger.
Right.
And that's really the primary task of angels in the Bible. I'm thinking of Gabriel showing up to Joseph and telling him, hey, your fiancée is pregnant, but don't worry, nobody did anything. It's God, and telling him basically stick around. There are a lot of other examples of that. We also see them providing protection. I think an angel is there to protect Daniel in the lion's den, for instance, or what were there? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Maybe getting people out of danger. Some of the apostles were in jail at one point, and there was an earthquake, and an angel says, "Get out." Basically pointing out the obvious. There's the exit. God made it. Go.
So they run all sorts.
They do all sorts of jobs, right?
All sorts of
they do what God needs.
Yeah.
What God needs done. But there are times when they're warriors leading in a battle. Most of the time, when that happens, it seems to be the archangel Michael. That brings me up to that archangel thing, but we'll get to that again in a second. And of course, there's also the fallen angels. You mentioned Morgoth, and certainly, Melkor has those parallels with Lucifer. That's probably the strongest parallel in Chapter 1, or in the Ainulindalë, I should say.
Yeah, I think so. Probably more so than any of the good Valar, the good Ainur. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there's so many parallels with Lucifer in terms of wanting to usurp Ilúvatar's place and pride and bringing down a bunch of angels with him, that kind of thing. So certainly the Balrogs and maybe Ungoliant would parallel those angels that fell with Lucifer, just as they fell with Morgoth. But the point is that I'm not sure I can buy into the premise that the warriors of God status of the biblical angels is something that we have to use to compare with the Ainur, because the angels' roles were larger. And given that, I don't think that the Ainur do compare very well, because they don't do those jobs for the most part. They don't go into Middle-earth and get people out of danger, or go bring food to people, or protect them in times of trouble. They
don't intervene very much.
No.
It sounds like. Yeah. I mean, that's true. They really don't. If you look at the Legendarium, they don't.
And Ilúvatar doesn't even use them to go and accomplish things in the individual lives of people in Middle-earth. He uses them to accomplish the shaping of the world, which is actually not a way that God used the angels in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? I mean, he finished the world himself, and the angels had nothing to do with the creation. So,
and that's Tolkien talked about that the demiurgical, I think, was the word that Tolkien used sometime. Yeah, that's sort of actually doing the work of shaping the world, right?
Yeah, they really are more like the Greek pantheon, or except that they are created beings themselves. That was really important to Tolkien, because, as we know, he had to create something that was consistent with his own beliefs, that could, as he said to Milton Waldman, be believed by somebody who believed in the Trinity.
Right.
But as for the division between Maiar, Valar, and angels, archangels, that one's even a little bit tougher. I have to admit, I wasn't really up to speed on this, but coming from a Protestant tradition myself, I'm only aware of one angel named in the Bible as an archangel, and that's Michael. But I do understand that the Roman Catholic Church's view is that there are three. And of course, that's the view that Tolkien would have been familiar with. My understanding is the whole seven archangels, is very more comparable to the Eastern Orthodox tradition. I don't know about Judaism. Judaism may have that as a tradition as well. I don't know, so I can't speak to that. But in terms of the Christian tradition, I don't know where the seven comes from, and certainly Lucifer wouldn't have been named as as one of them. But I just don't know about that. But I think the thing here is the angels are nowhere near as powerful as the Valar. Nothing in the Judeo-Christian tradition would lead you to think that angels could tear up continents. Oh, there goes Beleriand. I mean, that's,
right. Lifting mountains and dragging islands across the water.
And moving them. That's something that is beyond the scope of what an angel in the Judeo-Christian tradition would do. So I don't know that I could make a comparison to that degree. It's interesting. It's certainly interesting to talk about, and describing them as angelic beings is appropriate in the sense that they are subservient to God, and that they are second tier. They're created, even though they're eternal. They have a beginning, and they were not of the same material as God, or in this case as Ilúvatar. That's probably about the only similarity that I can come up with.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you've got some stuff on this, right?
Really, I do, but that was really interesting. I appreciate you walking through that, because I'm not as familiar with a lot of that stuff.
And I may not be too. I mean, in fairness, I don't know much about, let's say, the Orthodox traditions, or even
maybe the Jewish
traditions, the Jewish traditions as much. I'm familiar with it, but only vaguely. So when you get into something this specific, I have to tell you, I just don't know. I just know the Protestant tradition and to some extent the Roman Catholic tradition.
Yeah, and I got to say, once upon a time, I might have been able to answer for the Roman Catholic tradition, but it's been a long time since those teachings. So you're on your own on that one.
Yeah, you have to go to confession about that, right?
Yeah, but no, man, I think that's really, really an interesting walkthrough of it. I mean, I certainly think when Tolkien described them as angels, he fully knew all the connotations that word had, and being the philologist he was, I mean, and having a bit of a background in ancient Greek myself, the first thing I went to was angelos, just like you did, the meaning of messenger. And I know that etymology of a word doesn't always dictate what it means today, but
True.
certainly Tolkien would have been thinking about that as much as he was thinking about all the other stuff you talked about. So I definitely think that he must have had, in some sense, this idea of messengers. But as you say, I think you say the role is really much larger than that, and they not only send messages, or I don't know. I mean, they do occasionally mediate in terms of the knowledge and things like that Manwë and Ulmo and so forth kind of provide to the children of Ilúvatar. But then they also have that
the elves. I mean,
right. But then they also they're actually the ones who do the work. They're sort of the hands that actually shape the earth. That sort of demiurgical role.
Yeah, they step into the shoes of God in many ways.
But so I mean, I think you're spot on. I think you really raised some interesting points. The only other thing I would add to it is this is the second question I think in a couple of episodes where we've had a question about sort of the inspirations, relationships to other mythologies.
Right.
And
it was Bernat's questions about
Valhalla and Grimm's fairy tales and things like that.
Exactly.
And now we're recording this before that episode has aired, so I know Maya wouldn't have heard this yet, but since we've had two of these in a row, I actually will point out that just like we said last time, I think it's the differences between Ainur and Judeo-Christian angels that makes them interesting.
That's true.
And when I saw Maya say this thing about warriors of God, the first thing I thought of was a little thought exercise, just thinking about the degree to which they actually do fight wars on behalf of God or Eru or Ilúvatar.
Anyway, right.
Yeah. And so I actually started looking. And so let's take a little quick walk through the major the major wars that ended each age of Middle-earth history, right?
Okay.
So the first one is the War of the Powers. That's when the Valar, raised Autumno. They, kicked Melkor out to make way for the elves, right?
Dragged him in chains, but Ainur, yeah.
Right. The major combatants in that war were the Valar and Melkor.
Yeah.
We're not even told that the Maiar were there. They probably were, but we're not even mentioned. They're not even.
One would imagine one would bring Eonwë with you since he's
since
skilled
he's the
in arms.
warrior with arms. Yeah. So the War of the Powers was just all Ainur fighting each other.
Okay.
Then you get to the War of Wrath, which is at the end of the first age. Now, we haven't gotten to that yet.
No.
But
spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. It's going to be, there's actually going to be Valar and Maiar.
Yes,
and Vanyar. And
That's
Vanyar,
right.
the fair
Vanyar
elves, coming out of the west to bail out the elves, men, and dwarves of Middle-earth. So it starts as a war of Middle-earth, and then the angelic beings and the Vanyar come and bail them out.
Right.
Then you got the War of the Last Alliance. That's the end of the Second Age.
Right.
Now who fights that one? It's elves and men.
And dwarves.
And dwarves, some of Durin's dwarves, right? And I think there are also some of the wood elves of Lothlorien.
Right.
But no Ainur. No Ainur fight in that battle.
No Ainur at all. No Maiar, no Valar, nobody.
Right. I mean, we're to believe that Gil-galad was sort of the main commander with Elendil, sort of right by his side. But it's all elves and men and dwarves.
You're right.
And then when you get to the War of the Ring, right? And then you get to the War of the Ring, what do we see?
Oh, it's
mostly men.
Yeah.
There's some skirmishes, some elf skirmishes. There's some dwarf skirmishes in Erebor.
There's fighting up in Dale and all that, right?
Yeah, stuff that you really don't get unless you read the appendices. But where are the Maiar in the War of the Ring?
Yeah, other than Gandalf.
There's Gandalf. There's Sauron.
Well,
Saruman.
obvious. That's true.
Yeah,
Sauron.
And so they're.
Wouldn't we call him the warrior of God in that scenario, though?
No, exactly right. I mean, Gandalf is the only one who's really on the good side there.
True.
He's the only one who's following orders from God.
Right. And fighting. I mean, Radagast,
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
would have
Radagast
been doing the right thing, but probably not taking part in the combat.
Right, exactly. Radagast and Gandalf are not fighting at all, which I guess is sort of my point. They're sort of Radagast isn't even really that involved. Gandalf is at least an advisor, sort of a commander in a way, but really more of an advisory commander, leaving men to do the actual commanding.
That's true.
So I guess my point,
much more so in the books than he does in the movies. In the movies, he takes a much more active role. So if that's the thing you're thinking about is him fighting as much as he did, there were some moments though, didn't he? I mean, he had the confrontation with the Witch King.
He did, yeah.
But that ended when the Witch King took off after hearing the cock crow and the Rohirrim arrived.
The Rohirrim coming,
so, yeah. I don't know that there wasn't the level of combat that was involved in the films.
In the movies, yeah, exactly. And so my point in all this is to show that over the course of Middle-earth history, and we're going to talk about this later in the episode too, but over the course of history, the Ainur take less and less of a role in doing anything, really. And I think that includes being warriors for good, Yeah. And so I think that to me is sort of the most interesting thing about this comparison to warriors of God or, biblical angels or whatever is you really do see the Ainur just sort of starting out being very, very powerful, very influential, and sort of getting less and less so over time. And I think that is a key difference between, say, Tolkien's vision of what an angelic being or an Ainu would be versus probably the Judeo-Christian, framework that he would have grown up with.
Well, not as much difference as I would have thought, actually, because as you point that out, I start to think about, how much more active we see the angels in the Old Testament in terms of their interventions and things. Whereas by the time of the New Testament, there are fewer examples, it seems, and more messengery type stuff.
That's a good point, yeah.
As opposed to, the big battles, with the exception of Revelation, which is, of course, prophetic and talking about future war.
Right.
But yeah, and that would be a difference because there, the Ainur, if we want to talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition of angels being like the Ainur, they're going to be very active in the last battle. Whereas, like you point out here, it's all on men by the end.
Right.
So, interesting. That will definitely be an interesting segue into our discussion because we'll talk a little bit about that rise of men, won't we?
Yes, we will. But before we do, since we're talking about men tonight, I would like to spend a few more minutes on something else. I want to spend a few minutes on a case of Boys Will Be Boys.
Uh-oh. Does that mean it's time for another Tolkien fun fact?
Oh, you were right there with the music. Very well done. Yes, it does. We have a new Tolkien fun fact for you folks tonight, and I'm going to go ahead and
please do by all means
start talking about it to you. So today's Tolkien fun fact comes to us again from Carpenter's biography.
That's a great source for these things,
where a lot of these are. And I have to give a special shout out to our friend Alan R. In the UK.
The other half of the Argonath.
Yes, the other half of the Alan Argonath.
Yes, we are the Alan Argonath.
Yeah, we've got almost matching Allens, only their accents are different.
Oh, quite.
But he actually reminded me of this one. I had completely forgotten about it. And I saw him mention it, and I just reached out. I was like, where is that story again? He's like, it's in Carpenter's biography. I'm like,
of course it is.
Yeah, of course it is. But so this is a story about young Tolkien's undergraduate days at Oxford. And a little evening he spent with a little collegiate entertainment, let's say.
There were a few of those, weren't there?
There were a few of those. Yeah, he definitely was not the stodgy old Oxford Don in his youth. He was a bit of a
troublemaker.
A bit of a troublemaker. So one night actually culminated in young Ronald and his friends stealing a bus. And I'm going to read a little bit from Carpenter's biography here.
Okay.
And this is Tolkien's own account.
Okay.
At 10 to 9, we heard a distant roar of voices and knew that there was something on foot, so we dashed out of college and were in the thick of fun for 2 hours. We ragged the town and the police and the proctors all together for about an hour. Jeffrey and I captured a bus and drove it up to Corn Market.
We didn't steal one, we captured it.
Makes it sound very heroic, like he dragged the evil fallen bus away in chains. Captured a bus and drove it up to Corn Market, making various unearthly noises, followed by a mad crowd of mingled varsity and townies. It was chock full of undergrads before it reached the Carfax.
Oh my goodness.
There I addressed a few stirring words to a huge mob before descending and removing to the Maggers Memugger, or the Martyrs Memorial, where I addressed the crowd again. There were no disciplinary consequences of all this.
Oh my goodness, he got away with it.
He got away with it.
That rocks. I could never have gotten away with that in college.
Yeah. No, certainly not. But man,
I mean, I had my fun, don't get me wrong. I've done some pretty crazy things. Stealing a bus, not one of them.
Stealing a bus is probably farther than I would have ever gone. Maybe even in high school, I don't think I would have stolen a bus. But I don't know. It's such a vivid account. I've never
isn't it?
actually. I've never been to Oxford, so he's talking about some places I had to look up.
Yeah, I don't know what.
Yeah, so he talks about this corn market, and I think corn market is sort of like the shopping district of Oxford. So it was a pretty busy place that they took this stolen bus to.
Well, late at night though, like 11 o'clock at night.
Well, that's probably true. Yeah, maybe in the early part of the 20th century, maybe it wouldn't have been that crowded. But the Carfax that he's talking about, that where he kind of went to and sort of gave this speech.
You're going to have to clear that one up, because all I can think of is that Carfax that we see on the TV commercials.
That's all I was thinking of too. The commercial, which some of our international listeners may not be
horribly
familiar
annoying.
with. Yeah, but the Carfax is actually a tower at a major intersection, sort of in this district, and it's this tower is all that's left of a 12th century church.
Oh wow, cool.
So
we don't have anything that old here.
It's a perfect. No, we don't. Perfect place for Tolkien to give a speech.
Oh, absolutely. He'd be sounding
relic.
Yeah. A medieval relic giving a speech in a medieval relic.
Right. And I want to know what he said. I mean, what do you think?
Too. That's what I'm thinking. What did he say to the mob?
Right. This mob of undergrads and townies. So, one of the things they talk about in Oxford is like there's this big division between the town
and gown.
The townies and the gown, the people that are there to go to school.
Yeah.
I mean, him bringing them together like this, it's just, it's like the last alliance. It's the last alliance of town and gown. Like he's rallying them he might have rallied them for a war on Sauron or a war
on Saruman.
Or on Saruman, yeah. Or on some dean who had wronged him. Go steal the mascot of a rival school or something.
Oh, that's
like
awesome.
That.
Well, I just hope he didn't do this while dressed as a polar bear and wielding an axe. That might have been a little too much at the same time.
Probably would have been a little too much.
That might have gotten some disciplinary results.
Yeah, I'm sure. He probably would have lost the townies if he had started giving that speech in Icelandic.
In Icelandic. Like he used to do with Beowulf when he would do the first 50 lines, even lose students at that point. But
yeah.
My goodness. Well,
anyway,
that's classic stuff. And just a reminder that he was not some sort of stodgy old busybody, but a tremendously witty and funny guy who loved life. And
yeah,
I'm not sure I can admire him for Grand Theft Auto.
No.
But I try. I think I can. That's pretty cool. We captured it. I have to remember that next time I take something that's not mine.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't steal it. I captured it.
Now that I'm thinking about it again, all I can think of is Mr. Toad.
Yeah.
Stealing a car and going on his wild ride.
Well, on that wonderful note, I think we probably should move on to our discussion.
Probably so.
Here's how we turn a 3-page chapter into a 2-hour episode. We spend 20 minutes talking about something else.
Yeah.
Oh man. So
we should probably get on with it.
Let's do that. We'll start. I'll read those first couple paragraphs, and we'll talk a little bit about the Valar and this interesting change in the measurement of time.
All right, let's do it.
The Valar sat now behind their mountains at peace, and having given light to Middle-earth, they left it for long untended, and the lordship of Morgoth was uncontested, save by the valor of the Noldor. Most in mind Ulmo kept the exiles, who gathered news of the earth through all the waters. From this time forth were reckoned the years of the sun. Swifter and briefer are they than the long years of the trees in Valinor. In that time the air of Middle-earth became heavy with the breath of growth and mortality, and the changing and aging of all things was hastened exceedingly. Life teemed upon the soil and in the waters in the second spring of Arda, and the Eldar increased, and beneath the new sun Beleriand grew green and fair. Beautiful stuff, though I have to say that last line, the new sun, because he also uses the word green, it keeps making me think about the green sun.
The green sun?
That he talked about in On Fairy Stories.
On Fairy Stories, yeah.
I know that's just me transposing the words, but I couldn't get that out of my head, and I almost read it. And beneath the green sun, Beleriand grew new and fair.
The green sun, Beleriand grew new and fair.
It doesn't quite read as well that way, but anyway, I just couldn't help but think about that. Fascinating stuff here. There once again, this is kind of like the bliss of the Valar when they were in the light of the trees, and
party time for the Valar.
Yeah, exactly. They're just hanging out. It's like, hey, we're taking a couple days off. We're taking a break.
And to be fair, I mean, they've just created the sun and moon.
That is true.
That's a big deal.
That is a big deal. You're right.
But but Morgoth is still out there, and you know, it's not this new light is not completely dealing with the problem. It's checking.
We'll see. It does. Yeah, it checks it pretty well. But you're right. It's you know, he's still kind of in control to some extent. I thought it was interesting that we see the valor of the Noldor. This may be the first time we see the Noldor being described as valorous as opposed to, you know, just pitching a fit.
Just pitching a fit. Feanor pitching a fit, and then
seriously.
Oh, here I go blaming Feanor for everything again.
You know, I'm sorry. It is what it is. The Noldor are back in Middle-earth because of Feanor.
He throws a fit, and his family all says, "Yeah, we'll go too."
Yeah, I know.
We got nothing better to do than cross the grinding ice.
Exactly, and sure, while we're at it, we'll kill some Telerion, burn some ships.
But it is true. I mean, he mentions this valor of the Noldor, which we have not seen at all yet.
No.
I mean, and specifically in the context of valor of the Noldor in Middle Earth fighting Morgoth, we've not seen any of that.
Right,
yet,
exactly.
Which, we're about to, but
in fairness, we need to point out that we have seen some valor of the Noldor. Those that crossed the Helcaraxë. Yeah. Those that crossed the grinding ice certainly did so with valor.
Yeah. Yeah. And Fingolfin has generally been pretty valorous.
Well, right. I think he's even described as being the most valorous.
Probably. Yeah.
When we talked about the brothers, right? Which one was, Finarfin was the wisest and
was the wise one. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I wondered if this was just a little idiosyncrasy of the way the work was compiled. Because, I mean, I know that
because
the Silmarillion wasn't. Yeah, I mean, because I know the Silmarillion was sort of compiled from different. I don't know how much, this part of it was really completed and put in order and everything. And I just wondered if maybe there was. I don't know that we'll ever have an answer to that question.
No, I don't
that
know
was
if we will. I don't remember reading anything in history that would address that.
That would
sometimes though we see this sort of back and forth thing. Actually, we see a lot of this back and forth thing. Even in Lord of the Rings, there's a little bit of this where when we're following, Merry and Pippin, for instance, he'll reference something that Frodo and Sam are doing.
Oh, that's
except
true.
We haven't read it yet.
We haven't read it yet. Yeah, that's a good point.
Like the moon. There was Frodo looking out on the moon, and it was the same moon that Merry and Pippin, I can't remember that moment. It was in the window on the west. But there's that, and then we get a lot of that here in the Silmarillion, just in the last chapter, even when we go back to the Sindar, and how
that's a good point. Yeah,
we're kind of seeing ahead. I think it's just because it's written as a history book, and so it's kind of assumed that the reader would have some sort of knowledge of
the big events of history.
Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting, but that is a good point. I love the reference to Ulmo. It really made me think. I know we've talked not a lot, but a couple of times about Ulmo kind of being this rebel, which reminded me of that line in Unfinished Tales. And we've referenced this a couple times, but we've never read it. I'm going to I pulled the text for this tonight because I think it's relevant to what we're looking at.
Cool.
Especially because it's of men, right? He's talking to men.
Right.
In speaking to Tuor, Ulmo says, "Therefore, though in the days of this darkness I seem to oppose the will of my brethren, the lords of the West, that is my part among them, to which I was appointed ere the making of the world." So even before the world was made, he knew that his role was going to be to kind of keep an eye out.
To be this...
Right, to be the one that kind of goes almost against the will of Manwë, not Ilúvatar, and that's the key, because he's doing what Ilúvatar intended him to do.
Right.
He's just not doing what Manwë intended him to do.
Right.
So it's just interesting, and it makes me really love Ulmo even more.
Yeah.
I've kind of come to switch my favorite, over the time of the podcast, I've come to switch my favorite Valar from Aule to Ulmo. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved Aule, and I do love his creation of the dwarves and how he handles that. His repentance and the way he just, shows humility and accepts all of that. I think that's brilliant. But as we delved into some of the stuff from History of Middle-earth, especially the statute of Finwë and Miriel, I found Ulmo's argument so much more compelling than Aule's.
Aule is usually kind of on that. Aule's wrong in a lot of those arguments.
Exactly. And
Ulmo sort of ends up being. Right a lot of the time. Yeah. I've always been a big fan of Ulmo just because I like I always like the water guy, and I always thought that, and I like Ulmo because of the role he plays with Tuor in that story,
Yes,
and you know how much I love that whole story.
Yeah, that
But
exactly.
yeah, so I just
Well, and that's where that line was from. He's telling Tuor that himself.
Right.
But anyway, good stuff there. And I think Ulmo's climbing the charts.
Yeah, well, and you know, I think it's interesting because you talk about this role that Ulmo plays, and how it's sort of a unique role that we're pretty sure that it's a role that he was given by Ilúvatar.
Yeah. That
makes,
quote from the Unfinished Tales really does make that clear.
Makes it really clear. Yeah. I mean, that makes me wonder, you know, how much the Valar are being negligent here. I mean, we kind of give the Valar a hard time, you know, for ignoring Middle Earth and so forth, but it could be that their role is to start leaving Arda to the children of Ilúvatar.
Mm-hmm.
You know, now that the Noldor have gone back, men are now awakening. Maybe their role is to sort of step back a little bit and start leaving Arda in the hands of children, the children.
The children, right?
Yeah, not in the hands of children. No. As a father of two, I know that's never a good idea.
No.
But maybe it's just, but maybe that is sort of their role to step back a little bit, and it's Ulmo's role to continue to sort of intervene a little bit and keep an eye on things. I don't know.
It seems that way.
Pure speculation,
well, sure.
But it kind of makes me wonder.
Yeah, you know, I mean, you're right, because when we see them being negligent, to use, you know, for lack of a better word, earlier on, it does seem like it's an error, you know, and it seems like it's it's letting the pendulum swing the other way after they realize the error of their way,
right?
Kind of dragging the elves over there. But this does seem a little different, and I think it has to do with men. You know, we talk about the role that men play, and in fact, there's a passage in chapter 1 that kind of speaks to this. If I can find it.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about. Yeah.
There we go. So he's talking about the gifts that Ilúvatar himself is talking about what he's going to do. He's going to give them a new gift. And he willed that the hearts of men should seek beyond the world and should find no rest therein. But they should have a virtue to shape their life amid the powers and chances of the world, beyond the music of the Ainur, which is as fate to all things else.
Mm-hmm.
And of their operation, everything should be, in form and deed, completed, and the world fulfilled unto the last and smallest. Given that, it seems like they know they need to back off because they're the ones who are going to determine where the world goes now.
Men, you mean they?
Men.
They being men.
Yeah, sorry, you're right.
Yeah.
My pronoun must match the subject.
No, I know what you meant. Yeah.
Yeah, the men are going to be shaping things.
Yeah.
And they're not going to shape things very well at first, but it's their job. They're the ones. It's their operation.
Their fate. I mean, that's their destiny is to do that.
Yeah. So I think
fate, that's Well, and that's, I mean, that kind of goes back to what I was saying in the mailbag segment, you know, when we talked about Maya's question, you know, sort of this progression to more and more power to men. We see that in the Legendarium. And,
oh, definitely.
You know, I'll probably bring that back in a little later too. But
sure.
I think you're exactly right. I think that's exactly why they're doing it here.
Yeah, it does seem like it's much more intentional and correct. You know, whereas with the elves, maybe it wasn't so correct.
Right.
Because at that point, they were still supposed to be shaping the world itself in preparation for the coming of the children.
For the coming of the children, yeah.
So, and now we have this change in the measurement of time. I mean, all that for one paragraph, but, you know, we get the change in the mesurement of time. We go from what we...
This is the Prancing Pony podcast, after all.
Woo! 14 minutes a page. The years of the sun versus the years of the trees. We talked about this an episode or two ago, about the timeline. I guess this was actually 2 episodes ago with the Sindar, where we talked about that 9.82 years of the sun that a year of the tree was equivalent to. So these are much faster, and it seems like everything else goes faster because of it. You get the changing and aging of all things hastened exceedingly. So, you know, the Eldar increased, the breadth of growth and mortality, even death.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's. I love that this is referred to as a second spring, and so we're reminded of sort of how it's such a it's a blessed time, because we haven't seen that since
spring. You know, you're right.
Right, the first spring was the time of the lamps,
way back when,
and that was, you know, when Arda was still perfect,
right, unmarred. That was before it was Arda marred.
Right.
Wow.
And so here is a second spring that happens in Arda Mard. So, I think there's a little bit of spabimmy here.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
In terms of sort of, a time of blessedness and peace has come out of Morgoth's destruction of the trees.
That's true. The trees aren't destroyed. There's no sun and moon, and
right.
we don't get this change in Middle Earth. You're right.
Right, and we don't get light everywhere in Arda, which we have now.
That's true.
And that's what allows Yeah, and that's what allows everything to grow. Wow. But again, with that comes an acceleration of time.
Yeah.
An acceleration of aging, and so
because while this is still Arda Mard.
This is still Arda Mard, so maybe there's got to be a price. And so while this changing and this growth is happening, these things die quickly.
Yeah.
And so that's where that mortality comes in. So this is really this is an Earth that's becoming mortal. It's becoming a mortal place. It's becoming more like the Earth that we know.
That's true, which is also a fallen. I mean, again, tying it back almost to the question that we were asked by Maya. In that tradition, the reason that things die and the reason that this world is not perfect, and there are things like poisonous snakes and well, in Australia there's like 18,000 different kinds of animals that'll kill you, is because the world is a fallen place, right? What? The world is not like it was supposed to be in the first spring, when the world was perfect. So now it's fallen, and therefore heavy with the breath of mortality. The aging of things is hastened exceedingly. Right. Very interesting. Right. That's an excellent point. Really good stuff. And the Earth is becoming mortal. You're absolutely right. Well, into this mortal Earth comes the men, and I think you've got this next little paragraph, right? Yeah,
I'll start at the right after that break there. At the first rising of the sun, the younger children of Ilúvatar awoke in the land of Hildorian, in the eastward regions of Middle-earth. But the first sun arose in the west, and the opening eyes of men were turned towards it, and their feet, as they wandered over the earth, for the most part strayed that way. The Atani they were named by the Eldar, the second people, but they called them also Hildor, the followers, and many other names, Apanonar, the afterborn, Angwar, the sickly, and Firimar. I resent that one a little bit.
Seriously.
And Firimar, the mortals. And they named them the usurpers, the strangers, and the inscrutable, the self-cursed, the heavy-handed, the night-fearers, the children of the sun.
They couldn't just call them Steve.
I started out trying to read that one.
I didn't know they were called Dennis.
I didn't know they were called Dennis.
Well, you didn't bother to ask, did you?
It only took what, 40 minutes for you to sneak in that Python reference.
Wow. We need to chat with the elves about their...
Remember, we talked about their lack of tact with the names they give the dwarves.
The stunted people.
Here we go. Yeah. And this is not much better.
The sickly.
The usurpers. The strangers.
The heavy-handed.
The heavy-handed.
Oh, man.
Children of the Sun's not bad. I'm fine with that.
Isn't that interesting? It's kind of like one of these things is not like the others, and Children of the Sun is that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, you're horrible, you're evil, you're ugly, you're deformed, you're blah, blah, blah. Children of the Sun.
It makes me wonder if Children of the Sun is somehow a backhanded compliment.
I think it is, because we
realize it could be because the elves don't really like the sun. They don't. No, they're not orcs, obviously, but they're people of the stars. They're not really people of the sun. And,
exactly. Well, I think that's most closely tied to the usurpers, because in their mind they know that the rising of the sun means their eventual waning. Yeah. So this is you're kind of our enemy. You're the children of the sun, which makes you kind of anti-us.
You are the harbinger of our doom.
Unfriends, as I think they're called by some elves later on, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the green elves, maybe, Syrian, who basically say, hey, man, these guys are coming in and they're hunting our animals and they're chopping our trees, and we're going to be unfriends.
That's right. Tolkien and his unfriends.
They unfriended them.
They unfriended them.
But I caught something in here, and I think actually you mentioned it earlier, the Firimar. Remember when we talked about Muriel and how she was renamed Firiel, she that died? Yeah. That root, F-I-R. And here we see it again, and it means the mortals, those that die. Yep. Very interesting.
Yeah. So that those two names are related. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
clearly.
think you said you looked it up, and fear means something like exhale or expire.
Expire, right. Expire, not like a gallon of milk, but like to exhale,
Right.
If inspiration is to bring in
Is
air.
to breathe in. Expire, yeah, is to breathe out.
Expire.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll do that right into the microphone.
Very nice. Very
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, so definitely that, but that is the same, that's the root. And that,
Yeah.
in fact, I remember Furiel was both she that died and she that sighed, because when when she gave up her life, she simply exhaled and was done.
And so that exhalation is a sigh.
That's a sigh.
Yeah.
That's the one that it's your last sigh.
Right. Your last sigh.
Boy.
Very cool.
But
Well,
goodness.
you had something about this sunrise in the west, which we talked about a little bit with the sun and moon and sort of
Isn't
the
that
changing
interesting?
path.
The sun arose in the west. What a
Yeah.
weird, wacky thing to see. But yeah, I think when they first saw that, there's always this thing. We talked a little bit about the compass points of doom, and I think they'll come up again. This is always the good direction.
West, yeah.
West is always good. So they see the sun arise in the west, but what's cool is they only saw that happen one time. But for some reason, that's the direction they're heading.
Yeah.
Always. Even though after that, the sun rises in the east.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't say one time. We don't know how many times the sun
Well, that's
rose
true.
in the west,
Yeah,
do we?
that's true.
Before they changed
Before they
courses.
changed it, yeah. But even after it changed,
Certainly a short time.
they
Certainly
still,
less than one generation, one would imagine.
I would imagine so. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So yeah, men were born to seek this. They were
Right.
born. They looked west and they sort of seek that light, and they
Yeah.
just follow it, even when it stops rising in the west.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I mean, it's kind of like I don't know. You could think it stands for enlightenment, or you could think it stands for spirituality.
Sure.
Whatever. But it's definitely
Application,
says,
not allegory.
right, exactly. But it's clear that Tolkien is saying that men just sort of have this yearning, this that's sort of born into us.
For something beyond.
Something exactly, something beyond our worldly experience.
Yeah, and it's part of our wiring, part of who we are, just as part of our nature. And of course, we know that nature, in terms of that, in that context, is huge to Tolkien. That we always need to act in accordance with our nature.
Right.
But boy, those names.
Sickly.
Oh, goodness. Now, interesting. I wonder if Tolkien had changed his cosmology. We talked a little bit about this last time, about what, how he was going to change it. He wanted to change it to make it more accurate, to make it, consistent with what it really is. But if he did that, then
with
men
the Earth
could
actually revolving around the sun and everything. Yeah.
Well, yeah, or at least always rising in the east and preceding the trees. At some point, he had it preceding the trees, if I remember correctly.
Right. Yeah.
And in that situation, of course, men could no longer awake with the first rising of the sun. But in that story, he had the idea that Morgoth would darken the world with clouds. There would be great floods, and that men would awake on an island amid the floods, and thus, when the sun broke through the clouds, they welcomed the sun. So it was still, this idea that they would kind of love the sun, and they were always going to be the children of the sun, even if the sun had been around.
Even if they weren't
born
at
sun.
the same time as the sun, they would have been. They would have sort of recognized the sun as the bringer of light.
Exactly.
To this time of
saves them from the
rain.
floods. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. That's really.
It's just a little interesting thing that I remember.
Was that in Morgoth's Ring?
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
Okay, I didn't catch that. I'll have to go back and look at that one.
Yeah, it's good stuff. It was in that. Remember how we decided not to go too far in depth to the alternate cosmology because it was really kind of just unpleasant.
Yeah. Boy, and yes,
dark
it is
in many ways. It was in that section, so you can always take a look.
I might have skimmed over that.
And to our listeners who are familiar with it, they'll take a look, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit later on in that paragraph. We're going to start with To Hildorian. I'm not going to finish the paragraph, but I want to get to some stuff in here. To Hildorian there came no Vala to guide men, or to summon them to dwell in Valinor. And men have feared the Valar rather than loved them, and have not understood the purposes of the powers, being at variance with them, and at strife with the world. Ulmo nonetheless took thought for them, aiding the counsel and will of Manwë, and his messages came often to them by stream and flood. But they have not skill in such matters, and still less had they in those days, before they had mingled with the elves. Therefore they loved the waters, and their hearts were stirred, but they understood not the messages. And I thought that was interesting. We talked a little bit about their decision not to summon them, the negligence.
Yeah.
But it does appear here that, Ulmo is doing the counsel and will of Manwë in this case. He's not yet rebelling against Manwë by helping men, but he's not able to help them enough. He tells them, but they can't understand him.
So they are bringing a message to them.
Yeah, some sort of message.
But
His messages came, but they didn't have the skill to hear it.
They can't understand it.
Yeah. But they did at least, again, this is kind of showing their nature. We talked about the walking to the west. They still loved the waters. Their hearts were stirred. They knew in their hearts that something was going on.
Something was calling to them. They just couldn't understand what it was.
Exactly. But it's interesting that they fear.
Isn't that indicative of the human experience?
Hugely indicative.
Man.
We feel the call, but we don't understand it. And, we may spend our entire lives trying to figure out what that means for us.
Wow.
Yeah. And, of course, this also ties into the fact that they're not going to intervene as much with men.
Yeah. I've wondered, I've kind of gone back and forth on this, and I think you're right. I think it is largely a desire not to intervene too much. I sometimes wonder if the Valar feel like they made a little bit of a mistake with the elves.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know how much of this is just sort of like hindsight, like, oh, we really shouldn't do that again.
Well, they had a third of their kids run away.
Right, exactly. Or if there was just something about the fact that, men just couldn't go to the Undying Lands. But that doesn't seem right, because the Undying Lands are not the Undying Lands because there's nothing special about the Undying Lands. They're the Undying Lands because the Immortals live there.
Right, so. but not just the elves Immortals, but the Valar.
But the actual Valar,
I think there is something to be said for that. We'll probably touch on that later, but I get this.
Probably when we get to the Akalabeth.
That's what I'm thinking. But I get this feeling that mortals who would go there would kind of burn out faster. That they would, sure, what a way to go, but that there would be such an intensity that their nature was not intended to experience.
Where have I heard this idea? Maybe you and I have talked about this idea before,
it, I think.
Or is it in the text somewhere?
I don't think it is directly in the text. I think there's some hints in the letters.
Maybe so, yeah.
I think there's something in the letters because somebody talks about, would Frodo and Sam have lived
People
forever?
ask what happened to Frodo if Frodo and Sam...
Right,
yeah, exactly.
And there is something in the letters, and I'll have to pull up the actual text, and we will when we get to this topic, which will probably come up in the Akalabeth. But, there's this notion, there's this sense that because it's not in their nature to be immortal, they will not be immortal. Yeah. And that being mortal in a land filled with the immortals would only serve to bring you to the end of your mortality all that much sooner.
It would just wear you out. It's just too
the light's too bright.
Yeah, too bright of a flame, really. Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
That's again, that's kind of a logical conclusion one draws from various statements, but it's not explicitly said.
Right.
But
it's interesting, though.
But I don't think summoning them to come to Valinor would have been the right idea at all.
No. For lots of reasons. We talked about this most notably, if nothing else, just the idea that men were really supposed to be sort of kind of rule their own destiny, rule their own fate a little bit. Yeah.
Hopefully some D20s. Natural 20. Yes, success.
Critical hit.
Oh, man. We are geeks.
How many of our listeners do we alienate with that one? Probably not that
none.
many, actually.
I'm thinking very few.
Probably not that many.
Role-playing games, folks, D&D. The elves and the halflings, because for some reason they probably couldn't call them hobbits. But boy,
I think you're right.
They sure had hairy feet, and they were good burglars. So
Yes, they were.
Again, we talked in our interview episode recently with Doctors Femi and Higgins. We talked about how Tolkien shaped the fantasy and sci-fi worlds with language creation.
Yeah.
Well, he also shaped the role-playing game.
The role-playing games, Hobbits.
Yeah. So, he had such impact on so many things. But
even things like the plural of dwarf.
Yeah,
I mean,
you're right.
Before Tolkien, the plural of dwarf was dwarfs.
Dwarfs.
If you look at Grimm's fairy tales or even Walt Disney, it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Dwarfs.
And
nobody calls them dwarfs now.
Right? No, everybody says dwarves, especially in a fantasy setting.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure that's what it is in D&D and probably every role-playing game I've ever played.
Agreed.
Which is a lot.
Which is a lot. No comment there. No comment. Oh man.
So what about this love of water?
Yeah.
Did we talk about that one?
We did talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
Just that, we talked about the elves' love of water. And I think, let's contrast this with the dwarves' hatred of water, fear of water.
Mm-hmm.
Both the elves and men are natural children of Ilúvatar. They were the intended, chosen, created children of Ilúvatar, but the dwarves were not. They were the adopted children of Ilúvatar, willingly, lovingly, and all of that, but they were not originally intended to be.
Right.
So it's not surprising that those who were made by Ilúvatar had this love in
this
them
yearning
for the
water, this affinity for the water. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Just another similarity between elves and men. We'll get to more of those.
Yeah.
But anyway. So then they meet the dark elves. We're not going to read that, but they meet some of the Avari and are become their friends. So they learn probably a little bit of language. They learn a lot of things from them about how to survive and how to live. And But because those are the only ones they've met, they don't know of the Valar except as a rumor, and that's kind of important.
Right.
They say dark elves, but let's remember they're dark because they haven't gone to the light. That doesn't mean they're evil.
Right. Yes. So let's back off of our usual role playing.
Right. This isn't Drizzt Do'Urden or
right.
He wasn't evil, right? Drizzt wasn't evil. I can't remember, but
I can't remember. Maybe I don't know.
I just gone way off track.
Yeah. But yeah, exactly. These aren't the evil dark elves that we see in a lot of modern fantasy. They're just dark because they haven't seen the light. So when we hear about men becoming disciples of dark elves, don't get the wrong impression.
I guess they're not becoming dark disciples.
Right. Although they do that too.
Oh yeah, because they listen to Morgoth, right?
To them, which I think we're going to get to in a minute. But but not here. These aren't the ones that did
just
that.
Just to clarify that. But you have the next paragraph, right?
I do. Yeah. So we're back at Morgoth here.
We are. He always turns up.
He always turns up, like a bad penny. Morgoth had then not long come back into Middle-earth, and his power went not far abroad, and was moreover checked by the sudden coming of great light. There was little peril in the lands and the hills, and there new things, devised long ages before in the thought of Yavanna, and sown as seed in the dark, came at last to their budding and their bloom. West, north, and south, the children of men spread and wandered, and their joy was the joy of the morning before the dew is dry, when every leaf is green.
Man, that is a beautiful, last phrase, isn't that gorgeous?
Yeah, I love that.
The joy of the morning before the dew is dry. That is such a beautiful time.
Yeah.
That early morning. Oh.
It's that
freshness.
First awakening.
Yeah.
Everything is fresh. The whole day is in front of you. Anything is possible.
Absolutely. Limitless.
Yeah.
But I have to say, the first thing that hit me when I read this was the compass points of doom that we just talked about.
Well, that makes sense.
You left the east wind to me, but I'll not speak of the east wind.
Right,
Here we
exactly.
go, west, north, and south,
You've got this idea that men must have... Well, I think they probably started somewhere in the east.
Oh, yeah.
And migrated west, north, and south. Yeah. Which means, if you think of the compass points of doom, men are just sort of, they're going up. They started in a lower place than where they're going to. They're sort of growing, progressing, learning. That's really cool.
That is.
I think the other thing I noticed is, I'm just, me, and I'm a fan of Yavanna, and we talked about some of the plants that she devised a long time ago. They're finally able to grow, and there must have been a lot of plants. I know nothing about plants, even though I'm a Yavanna fan.
You're not a horticulturist?
I'm not a horticulturist. Horticulturist.
You're definitely not that either.
No. But there's all these. I'm sure there's loads of plants that just need lots of sunlight, and they just couldn't grow before now.
Right.
And now they can, now that there's a sun. And
yeah, before
and
it was
that's
just
cool,
like
yeah.
what mosses and stuff like that. And now
Yeah,
it's,
yeah.
you know, full
Night
bore.
blooming flowers and things like that. But now, the sun is out, the earth is kind of safe for living things again. Morgoth is contained a little bit.
Yeah, he really is,
Check.
isn't it?
Check,
He's
at
in
least,
check. Yeah. I mean, he's still a threat and he's still strong, but
Yeah.
at this point, he's still very much gathering his strength to himself. And then, he's afraid of the sun. Let's not forget. He's so afraid of it that, he raises up the peaks of Thangorodrim and, the great reek that comes out from
All
them
these
and the
fumes,
smokes and
these smokes.
just trying to cover the sun.
Yeah.
He hates it.
But his growth is slowed. And that's exactly, we talked about that. That's one of the reasons that the Valar created the sun. That's what they wanted.
Yeah, they wanted it to slow him down, to put him in check, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
so you've got the next.
I was gonna say, unfortunately, that happiness is short.
Yeah. Yeah.
All good things must come to an end. We get the ticking clock here.
Yep.
And we've talked about that ticking clock a lot, but here's the next little section. But the dawn is brief, and the day full often belies its promise. And now the time drew on to the great wars of the powers of the north, when Noldor and Sindar and men strove against the hosts of Morgoth Bauglar, and went down in ruin. To this end the cunning lies of Morgoth that he sowed of old, and sowed ever anew among his foes, and the curse that came of the slaying at Alqualande, and the oath of Feanor, were ever at work. Only a part is here told of the deeds of those days, and most is said of the Noldor and the Silmarils, and the mortals that became entangled in their fate. I'll stop it there and let you take the rest later, but there's a lot here, really.
Entangled, that's a strong word. I like that word.
Entangled in their fate.
Yeah.
The first thing we see is that go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make a quick note about this name Bauglar. I don't know if we've seen this before or if we've seen it. Yeah, it doesn't come up a lot, but it is one of Morgoth's names or epithets that comes up a couple of times. And I had to look it up. I just now looked it up. It means the constrainer.
Mm-hmm.
One who constrains. So
Man. Yeah. Kind of like
Anyway.
like the warden of a prison.
Yeah.
Now, the first thing I see here is the cunning lies, and it made me jump back to chapter 7. This is when he's making the Noldor kind of get into conflict with each other. There's this wonderful line that we spent some time on then, and I'll just go back to the line. But he that sows lies in the end shall not lack of a harvest, and soon he may rest from toil indeed, while others reap and sow in his stead. And sure enough, that's what we get here.
That's exactly what's happening,
That's exactly what we get. But there are 3 elements here, 3 things that are ever at work. And it's really important, I think, to weigh these in the balance. And because we're going to see that 2 of these things are Feanor's own fault. Yeah, we get Morgoth lies are at work. But also at work is the curse because of the kinslaying and the oath. That oath is going to drive so much of this story going forward. Morgoth's lies have a lot to do with it. We know that. And, we don't... Morgoth has a lot to do with Feanor's fall, but Feanor still chose it, right? We talked about this before. He's still responsible. You can't say the devil made me do it and, just throw your hands up and say you're innocent. But boy... You
can certainly say the lies certainly, were a catalyst. Catalyst. I would not even say the only catalyst.
Oh, no. His pride and greed and all
absolutely.
Those things were...
Yeah. But... the lies are just part of it. Like you said, Feanor had to make the decision to do the things that he did. And then even after the kinslaying, there was still an opportunity for him to repent, to turn back, to go back to Valinor and say...
Well, actually, no, not for him, remember?
Though that's true.
Him and his sons were forever banished at that point.
Not to go back. I shouldn't say to go back and live the life he had.
No, you're right. But they could have repented and acted in accordance. You're right.
Yes, right. Not to physically go back. You're right.
No, you're right.
But to say, no, we've made a horrible mistake, and please
and
just
then do what they could
deal with
right.
us.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, they could have.
But they didn't.
They doubled down.
Yeah,
because that's what he does.
Right.
But yeah, I just thought that was really key. That was so important that I wanted to spend a little time on those 3 elements that come into play through the rest of this text that were ever at work: the lies of Morgoth, the curse from the kinslaying, and the oath of Feanor. but now you get.
And that's a good point, because I think, well, before we move on to that, I just think it's interesting, because when you look at the oath as that missed opportunity for repentance,
right?
The oath is a big deal.
It's a huge deal.
The oath is not just the footnote in his fall.
No.
I mean, the oath is a major part of his fall, and it's clearly at least equal in these three elements that you've identified.
Yeah,
it seems like.
Yeah.
So. Anyway, that's interesting. I never thought of it that before. I never really picked up on these three elements, and I don't think it ever really struck me just the impact of the oath, the significance of the oath.
And we'll see it more in next chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, so what the other thing, of course, is that he gives us a little bit of that framework. Only a part is here told of the deeds of those days. So we're reminded once again, this is a history that's limited. And in this case, it's limited to primarily the Noldor and the Silmarils and those mortals that became entangled in their fate.
Right.
So, we don't. That's why, for example, this isn't a book about the history of the Green Elves of Osirian.
Right. That's true.
It would be a pretty boring story.
Or the Vanyar. It probably would have been a pretty boring story.
That would have been So we were listening to Manwë again today? OMG, did you hear what Manwë said?
And then we sang.
And then we sang to Varda.
And
we checked out what Manwë was wearing. It was blue again.
It was blue again. Oh man! What not to wear?
What?
It's a Niquidale edition.
Nobody should ever wear red on Niquidale.
Yeah,
just clashes with the blue.
Yeah.
Anyway, so why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the nature of elves before I say something I'll regret.
All right. So this
is not
is
too late.
The rest of that paragraph.
Yes.
In those days, elves and men were of like stature and strength of body, but the elves had greater wisdom and skill and beauty. And those who had dwelt in Valinor and looked upon the powers as much surpassed the dark elves in these things as they in turn surpassed the people of mortal race. Only in the realm of Doriath, whose queen Melian was of the kindred of Valar, did the Sindar come near to match the Calaquendi of the Blessed Realm.
Okay, that's worth exploring a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. We've talked a little bit about the difference between Calaquendi and Morroquendi.
Wow, but to see it visualized like that, the Calaquendi are so much
they're
more
as high above the Avari or the Morroquendi,
as they
with the exception of the Sindar, as the Morroquendi are above men. Wow,
that's huge.
So when you compare a mortal, like let's say a Boromir, who's pretty much pure mortal, to like a Galadriel, there's a huge difference there, and of course we see it.
Huge. I mean,
we see it.
I mean, even comparing to
Aragorn.
Well, who would actually have some Elvish in him, but I'm thinking to like a Legolas, a Morroquendi.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Comparing him to him, and then comparing him to a step above that with Galadriel. Yeah. Boy.
That's pretty cool.
It is, but notice what it is that makes them, each of those steps, different. It's the light. It's light. And, we've talked about this before, about light being such a central theme in the works here. It's just, another point that we see. What's the difference? It's just the light.
Yeah.
Because there's not much in the way of bodily difference, right? I mean, we just saw that, the Morroquendi and Calaquendi certainly are identical in terms of their bodies, both, the beauty and all of that.
Right.
But then we talked also about the fact that the Elves and Men are really similar.
Yeah.
At least go ahead. You had a quote from one of the letters, right?
Yeah. Tolkien himself actually once said, and we may have brought this one up before. I can't recall, but I think
we did, because it probably led to some discussion of Toriel and Keeley.
Probably, yeah.
Or as I refer to her, she who shall not be named.
Right, yeah. I'm sure we found a way to work that one in.
So now that I've spoiled that, what was the actual quote?
But it was Tolkien's letter 153, where he wrote that elves and men are evidently, in biological terms, one race, or they could not breed and produce fertile offspring.
That is such a key point, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Again, going back to that thing about Children of Ilúvatar, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Elves and men are not only more alike than elves and dwarves or men and dwarves, but they are one race. We might say they're one species. They're just different sort of
different genuses, perhaps.
Different, yeah, or different levels.
Genus is above species.
I think genus is above species, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't remember what's below species. Different.
I don't know.
Subspecies, I guess, but
cultivars or subspecies or something. I don't know, but the different breeds, maybe. I don't know, but there's different levels of sort of illumination there, but they are biologically one race, and we kind of get that in this passage where it talks about the strength, the stature and strength of body, but the elves had greater wisdom and skill and beauty, and that has a lot to do with the light.
Yeah,
and everything to do with the light, I would say.
But stature and strength of body were the same, or of like stature. We see that just like the elves, their bodies are of the stuff of the earth. They could both be slain.
Right.
Dwarves could too, in all fairness, but their bodies, we don't know really the manufacture, shall we say, of their bodies in comparison,
of dwarven bodies,
they're not made by Ilúvatar.
Right.
And I think that really is what it boils down to. That's why, to bring it all back around to She Who Shall Not Be Named, that's why this idea of a romance between two species that are entirely different, that could never, that they're not biologically compatible, was so troubling to so many people.
Exactly. And as we'll talk about, because I'm sure I'll bring this back again at the end when we talk about some of the further differences between elves and men at the end of the chapter. In like 2 paragraphs.
And I was going to say we're almost at the end of the chapter.
Yeah, but it's there's a significance to the romances between elves and men. It's not just
and you will point those out. That's true. I've looked at your notes on that. That's
So it's not just this idea of creating star-crossed lovers or something like that. From different places, different races. It's elves and men coming together is very significant, and we'll talk about that in a bit.
It's very significant, which is why it's also very rare.
Right. Exactly.
But it's possible because they're both children of Ilúvatar. We talked about there was a question a couple episodes back about Ainur reproducing, and we talked about it in the context that it wasn't so much that Melian was able to reproduce; it's that Thingol, being a child of Ilúvatar and intended to reproduce, could reproduce even though he was married to a Maya.
Right.
It's not that the Maya could reproduce, because what she produced was still
a child of Ilúvatar.
Was still a child of Ilúvatar.
Mm-hmm.
And that's key, because she couldn't reproduce a type of Ainu, because she could not reproduce something that was of Ilúvatar's thought.
Right.
Yeah. So it's all about that biological compatibility. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Really.
And I love it. Really beautiful, especially that whole idea about the light elevating them.
Yeah.
But now we're going to get
really
to the nature of men. So I'm going to go ahead and take this next paragraph. Except I'll probably stop partway through, because there's a couple different things that we want to talk about in here, but we'll start. Immortal were the elves, and their wisdom waxed from age to age, and no sickness nor pestilence brought death to them. Their bodies indeed were of the stuff of earth, and could be destroyed. And in those days they were more like to the bodies of men, since they had not so long been inhabited by the fire of their spirit, which consumes them from within in the courses of time. And that's where I want to stop first, because then we'll get to men. So this is still a little bit of the elves.
Yeah.
But it's about their death, and it's about, what could kill them. Fascinating stuff. What do you make of not so long been inhabited by the fire of their spirit, and that because of that they were more like to the bodies of men? What do you get from that?
I've actually got a little bit on this in my my stuff that I put together about the waning of the elves.
Oh, okay.
I think it really is tied in with that. There's this idea that the elves' bodies over time are literally consumed by their spirits. And this is actually described in Morgoth's Ring.
Oh yeah, you're right, it is.
And as this happens, their bodies become less and less physical, and their bodies change. In fact, since we're talking about it now, I will actually just pull this up.
Sure.
We've got, so this actually comes from Laws and Customs Among the Eldar. Okay. So Tolkien says, as the weight of the years, with all their changes of desire and thought, gathers upon the spirit of the Eldar, so do the impulses and moods of their bodies change. This the Eldar mean when they speak of their spirits consuming them, and they say that ere Arda ends, all the Eldaliae on earth will have become as spirits invisible to mortal eyes.
Wow.
Unless they will to be seen by some among men into whose minds they may enter directly.
Wow.
Yeah, and then just a couple pages later, he kind of elaborates on this a little bit, where he says, as ages passed, the dominance of their Fëanor, so remember that's their soul,
right,
ever increased, consuming their bodies, as has been noted. The end of this process is their fading, as men have called it, for the body becomes at last, as it were, a mere memory held by the Fëa.
Wow.
So because remember, they're immortal. They're immortal within Arda. They become pure spirit as time goes on. By the end of certainly by the end of Arda, they would be beings of pure spirit. Probably even by our time.
Right.
That they're
that's a fascinating way to also make sure that it's a great way for us to tie the mythology to our own world today and say, well, no wonder we don't.
And explain why there's no elves left, why there's no Elvari running around. Yeah, exactly.
Except for those of us whose minds they may enter directly.
Right.
I meant to tell you about that. I've been having this conversation.
Have you been a little touched by the fairy world? Yeah, so I think that's exactly what he's talking about here. This is still early. This is still in the youth of elves, and so their bodies are still corporeal in a way. They're still more physical.
corporeal than they would be later, certainly.
Yeah,
and that kind of maybe explains their ability to survive the Helcarax as well. We talked about that a couple chapters back, and how they I guess it was just actually last chapter, and how they, making it across, what hardihood and woe,
because they were so strong. They were in the sort of
in their prime.
Their prime.
That's what it was, the prime. Good stuff.
Yeah.
So now let's take a look at men. We've just looked at elves, and then we'll finish this paragraph. But men were more frail, more easily slain by weapon or mischance, and less easily healed, subject to sickness and many ills. And they grew old and died. What may befall their spirits after death, the elves know not. Some say, here we go, we get another some say, right?
Another some say, yeah.
Some say that they too go to the halls of Mandos, but their place of waiting there is not that of the elves, and Mandos under Ilúvatar alone, save Manwë, knows whither they go after the time of recollection in those silent halls beside the outer sea. None have ever come back from the mansions of the dead, save only Beren, son of Barahir, whose hand had touched a Silmaril. But he never spoke afterward to mortal men. The fate of men after death, maybe, is not in the hands of the Valar, nor was all foretold in the music of the Ainur. Some great stuff, and it kind of brings me back to our episode, a while ago now, episode 10, I think it was.
Episode 10,
on death.
On death.
That was a lot of fun to research. We pulled a lot of stuff from History of Middle-earth, and I'm going to do that again here, because in the earliest versions of the Silmarillion, or in one of the earlier versions, he initially stated that men did not go to the halls of Mandos, but also that they were not, but that they were also not born again, like the rehousing of the elves. He changed it to what we see here, that they went to the halls, but not the same places where the elves went. They were never reborn on Earth, but of course then he, this exception that proves the rule regarding Beren.
Right.
But in the earliest versions, and this was interesting, in the earliest versions in the Book of Lost Tales, men would go to the halls of Mando's wife. Now, it wasn't, who's his wife now?
Vaire,
that's right. Then it was a woman named Fui. I'm sorry. She probably liked tuna sandwiches.
She probably ate some bad tuna.
And she would judge these men and send them to one of three fates: dwelling with the gods in Valinor, which sure sounds like heaven to me; taken by Melkor to Angband, which, let's just remember, that's the Hells of Iron.
Yeah, and that certainly sounds like the opposite of heaven.
Yeah, or they'd be put on a ship that wanders until the end. Very purgatorial. Christopher Tolkien comments that this is, and I've got a quote from this, a rare and very suggestive glimpse of the mythic conception in its earliest phase. For here, ideas that are drawn from Christian theology are explicitly present. Two things to comment on that. One, I would say Catholic theology. As a Protestant, I have purgatory, whatever. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just mean that's certainly not a concept that I'm aware of. But it is certainly a Catholic concept of purgatory. But it's also interesting because Tolkien later on would point out that he does not want to have any explicitly Christian things in his book. That's one of his main points is I don't want that in here. Which I think it's excellent.
He wants it to be compatible without actually having elements of it.
It needs to be compatible because, of course, that's for his own internal use, if nothing else. But he didn't want it to be, a preachy thing that only applied to people who have that worldview. And we've talked about this before, how applicable this is to every worldview, really.
Yeah.
Anyway, but by the time he began The Lord of the Rings back in 1937, he had reached this final position. And that's why this is the canonical one. This is the final version. Men are mortal. They have to die. They're not bound to the world. Only God knows their fate after death. Possibly Mandos and Manwë, maybe. That only they know whither they go. That the elves know not. But I love this idea that they're not. It's not even in the hands of the Valar, maybe.
Yeah.
The fate of men after death, that is.
Yeah, because again, the Valar, because elves and men are both the children of Ilúvatar. The Valar don't completely understand us, and so they don't really know what Ilúvatar has planned.
But they understand the elves a little better in that regard because the elves,
think so, probably because of the way that they both. I think they're probably more like the elves because
they're bound to the earth.
They're bound to the earth.
Their life is the life of Arda. Yeah.
Right, and they both have immortality within Arda.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean the elves have to go through the whole debodying, rebodying process.
Right.
But I mean the
that's
Valar,
just like changing clothes for the Valar.
Oh, right, exactly. What raiment shall I pick today?
Raiment, yeah.
The Valar
blue. Always blue.
Always blue. I'm gonna see the Far Side comic now. Manwë's closet.
Manwë's closet. It's just a bunch of blue
all
robes.
Blue shirts and blue jackets and blue robes and blue ties and blue jeans. No.
Blue hats.
Man, and like he listens to the Moody Blues.
Yeah, there you go. And Madonna's True Blue album.
Oh well, no, Manwë's got a better taste than that.
You said it, not me.
Of course I did. I'll take the heat for that. Oh goodness,
Man.
We are gonna be in trouble. It's fun stuff though.
That's what makes it fun.
It really is. But I just that little piece of stuff from the Book of Lost Tales I thought was just kind of interesting to see once again how the story develops in his mind.
The development, yeah.
Because back then that's when elves were reincarnated. I love how he changed everything over time, refining it, making the story work together.
Yeah.
This version makes so much more sense, and it keeps the mystery about it.
It does, and it removes it, and again, it removes it from that Catholic viewpoint.
Exactly.
Of course, the Catholic viewpoint inspired it because that's what Tolkien believed.
Right.
But by removing it from that, he makes it more universal,
less exclusive,
or universally applicable and less exclusive.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what he was trying to do. And it's a good reminder, and I'm glad that you brought it up because we have talked quite a bit about theology in this episode, just because the subject matter and the question we had.
Creation of men. That's going to be a relevant subject.
Right, exactly. and we intentionally pulled in a theological question from Barlowman's bag. But, but it's important to note that Tolkien intentionally wrote and rewrote his mythology specifically to take out the overt theological references and just leave that applicability that you or I or anybody who comes to this text can apply something that they're familiar with.
Exactly. Avoid the allegory. Keep out the references that are going to date it and make it fixed. I mean, that's what he thought was the fatal flaw to the existing mythologies of England was the inclusion of.
Like the Arthurian legend.
Right.
Yeah,
the explicit inclusion of Christianity was, in his mind, the fatal flaw. That it needed to include those truths, but not those details.
Those specific details, like the Holy Grail and things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
interesting.
Well, now we get to the fating of the elves.
Yeah.
If you want to take that last paragraph, and then we'll discuss that.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna take the first half, and then we'll talk a little bit about fading, and then we'll take the last.
Oh yeah,
paragraph.
because that last couple.
I gotta linger on that last bit.
Man, and I couldn't have taken that from you. I couldn't have pried that.
No,
I was cold dead.
We agreed on this a long time ago. I was getting this paragraph.
We agreed. I'm going to put "agreed" in air quotes because I think the catch of you deciding to co-host was based on you getting to say anything about Eärendil.
That is true. Not ever. I'll let you talk a little bit when we come to that chapter.
I'm glad to know that. Go ahead.
All right. In after days, when, because of the triumph of Morgoth, elves and men became estranged, as he most wished, those of the elven race that lived still in Middle-earth waned and faded, and men usurped the sunlight. Then the Quendi wandered in the lonely places of the great lands and the isles, and took to the moonlight and the starlight, and to the woods and caves, becoming as shadows and memories, save those who ever and anon set sail into the west and vanished from Middle-earth. So I wanted to stop there because I want to talk about this waning and fading, and we've already hinted at, we've already talked about exactly what it is. We've talked about this idea that the elves that stay in Middle-earth, as they stay, their bodies do fade, literally fade. And I just wanted, this has always been a concept that's fascinated me. And so I wanted to spend a little time just kind of talking about it. I think it's interesting that you pointed out that even though this paragraph talks about elves fading, waning and fading later, you pointed out the fact that this is really beginning now because the sun has risen. And the sun is sort of the first harbinger of their waning.
That's why the elves don't. That's why they call them the children of the sun and the usurpers. Right. And here we get it. Men usurp. And here we get the word usurp. Right. Clearly ties those two together.
Yeah, that's a good point. Boy, I didn't even catch that. Yeah. And even if you go back to chapter 3, when when the elves first awoke in Cuivianen, or before they awoke, actually, Yavanna had suggested, maybe putting some light out there to prepare for the elves coming.
Yes.
And that was when Mandos said, "It is doomed that the firstborn shall come in the darkness, and shall look first upon the stars." And then he said, "Great light shall be for their waning."
Yep.
So that great light is here. I mean, the sun and moon is here, and that tells me that this is the first step in the process of their waning.
Now, they've had a long run. It's been about 50,000 years.
They've had a very good long run, yeah. But it is, they are moving on to that. They're really moving on to the last act for them, which is kind of sad when you think about it that way.
Well, it's interesting. Now that I do think about that and I'm comparing the timelines, I mean, from the beginning, we'll have to look at the actual timeline from when the elves awoke. But it's not as though they only got a little bit of time on the scene.
That's true. No, they got, tens of thousands of years. Yeah.
Versus, the first, second, and third age.
Yeah. Which is
the first age was measuring the light of the sun, measuring the years of the sun.
Right.
I'll have to get those out. We'll look into that. That's an interesting question because, this is really like the last 10% of their lifespan, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you're looking at about, I think, there's about 500 years in the first stage of after the sun rises, I think. Right. And then, about a little over 3,000 years in the second and third ages. So, yeah, about 7,000 years plus, whatever's happened since.
Right. Well, yeah, and that could be incredibly long time. And that could be,
who knows, yeah.
But that's why they're invisible now.
Right. Exactly. One of the things I thought of when
my mind.
They talk to you, Alan. Do they talk to you? Do the elves talk to you?
My lawyers advised me not to answer that question.
So yeah, this waning process has already started, and I got to do this before I move on. I got to bring in. We've had a few quotes from our friend Kosh from Babylon 5 before.
Yes.
There's one of his that I love. It's so Kosh. He says, "The avalanche has started. It is too late for the pebbles to vote." And I don't know. That's what's going on here.
The pebbles are the elves. The avalanche of the men has begun.
Yeah,
I thought about that same thing, actually. I couldn't help but remember that. We'd been talking about Kosh, and he hadn't shown up in the last few episodes. So
no, we didn't get to bring him up in the last few episodes.
Yeah, it's the avalanche has started.
Yeah.
Of course, you have to say it all, mystically
all
and breathy.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
The avalanche has started. It is too late for the pebbles to vote.
That's beautiful.
Sorry. That was actually pretty bad.
It's been long enough since I've watched Babylon 5 that it sounded perfect to me. So I'll put it up there with your Ungoliant
with
voice.
all those, oh, no. That may go with my Gollum voice, where it's like mediocre and acceptable if you're drunk or something. But please, no, the Ungoliant does warrant its own tier. That was a good one.
Yeah, it does.
Of course, she's never going to speak again, which is exactly how my voices go. The ones I never get to use.
I'm sure she'll make an appearance when we least expect her again.
Of course she will.
She better.
Does Rosie get any lines at her wedding with Sam? Maybe I could read them in her voice.
Oh, that's creepy, man. That's just messed up. Because he's having nightmares for the rest of his life anyway. He's having giant spider nightmares.
Oh, man. That's going to be like 4 years from now when we get to the end of The Return of the King. But I'll see if I can remember that.
Yeah. We'll make a note and save it on whatever futuristic storage system we have by then.
My holodisc.
Right? Oh, man.
All right.
So anyway, so the elves are waning. They're already waning.
They
and we've talked about
our audience is waning at this point. But anyway.
Yeah, we've talked about the fact that men are going to have dominion over Arda, and Tolkien himself said, I won't spend too much time on this quote, but again in Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien said that the waning of the elvish Hroar must therefore be part of the history of Arda, as envisaged by Eru, and the mode in which the elves were to make way for the dominion of men.
Yeah,
so
makes sense.
So yeah, exactly. So and he even goes on to say something about how I won't read the whole thing, but basically the idea that that this is actually a sad thing to elves, because they say that men are largely governed as they are by the evil of Melkor, have less and less love for Arda as itself. And are largely busy in destroying it in the attempt to dominate it. And so,
Ouch.
I know. Again,
hurts, but
the elvish lack of tact. No, he's not wrong. And so,
well, that reminds me, that quote I went back from chapter 1 about the gift and the whole idea about fate and the music. But right after that, Ilúvatar knew that they would not use their gifts well. And he said, and I love this line because this brings us all back, as we often do, to Spibimi. These two in their time shall find that all that they do redounds at the end only to the glory of my work. But you're right. A little bit of that point that Tolkien made in the Athrobeth shows up there when the text says that the elves believe that men are often a grief to Manwë, who knows most of the mind of Ilúvatar. For it seems to the elves that men resemble Melkor most of all the Ainur, although he has ever feared and hated them, even those that served him. So, yeah, good tie-in though. Bringing that in from the Athrobeth really makes that fit better. Yeah,
and I think that it's just it is because of this this way that men are easily swayed by Melkor that I think we get a little bit of hope for this in sort of even though the elves are gone, let's say, there remains a little bit of a strain of elves among men, doesn't there?
Well, sure. Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the last couple lines, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And Tolkien himself said that the elder children, though the elder, this is in one of his letters. He says the elder children doomed to fade before the followers, men, and to live ultimately only by the thin line of their blood that was mingled with that of men, among whom it was the only real claim to nobility. And so, even though the elves are doomed to fade and leave Arda to men who are probably just going to muck it up because we're so easily swayed by Melkor, the leaders of men will be those who have a strain of this elvish blood, which is also going to be a strain of, there's going to be a tiny strain of Ainuran blood from Melian.
You're right.
And so it's this elvish blood that's going to ennoble men and ennoble those men who are going to be the ones to step up and lead men through the rest of Arda.
Wow.
And that's just a beautiful concept to me.
It really is.
It's those who have, again, there's this link physical link back to Fairy, to Valinor, to the elves.
And once again, it's that teamwork thing. You know, it's
once again, it's the teamwork.
All of it's the Ainurin, the Elvish, and the Mannish combined, and the strengths of all of those. Yeah, because each has their strength.
Right. Wow. And so exactly, and so I think that this is a deliberate plan. Tolkien himself even said it was part of a divine plan.
Didn't he? I remember reading something about that
in one of the other letters. And so when we talk about Beren and Luthien, Tuor and Idril, Aragorn and Arwen, you know, the elf,
the only times
couples,
that we had,
the only times.
Well, there was one other that was who was it that we hear about?
There was Andrath and
well, but they
Finrod's
never
brother. They never actually were married.
Right. I think it was the woman. The woman was the, and Imrahil is supposed to have descended from her. Yeah, you know where I'm going, and I can't remember her name.
Is it? Oh my goodness!
She like went off into the sea or something like that.
There's a river. There's a river that's named for her, right?
Right.
My goodness, why?
Somebody's going to write in and say,
our listeners are going to,
Yeah, well, you know, we're tired, it's late, and we didn't take notes on that.
We didn't plan to talk about this.
So. No, I'll see if I can't figure something out while you're touching a little bit more on these three. I think that's important.
All right. Yeah. So, I just think it's important that we see that these are the only times that this actually happens, that a romance actually happens, and there are children. And it's part of the elves' purpose. It's the fulfillment of the elves' purpose on Arda, which is to ennoble men for their destiny of ruling Arda. And that again takes us back to, again, not to bash on Keely and Tauriel, but it's just there's a difference there. The idea of putting these, you know, Beren and Luthien together was not just, you know, it's a great love story. It is, but it's also part of this huge plan for the ennoblement of the human race. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I don't know, a major part of the legendarium.
Yeah. Nimrodel.
Thank you. Nimrodel. My goodness. How could I not remember that?
Yeah. And we found that out in Unfinished Tales, in which that was revealed. So we do have that. But that's, it wasn't Nimrodel herself. It was one of her maidens or something.
I don't know. Drawing a
I can't remember, but of course she was Sylvan, not Noldoran, so that's
right.
Not even Sindarin for that matter. I can't remember now.
I don't know. I'm drawing a complete blank on it.
Nimrodel, she was one of the companions of Nimrodel, if I remember correctly, and Mithrilus. Let me look that up. I think our listeners are like, "Come on, you people!"
All right. I'm going to go ahead. While you're looking that up, I'm going to go save face by reading the rest of this paragraph.
Please do. I'll find this.
But in the dawn of years, elves and men were allies and held themselves akin. And there were some among men that learned the wisdom of the Eldar and became great and valiant among the captains of the Noldor. And in the glory and beauty of the elves, and in their fate, full share had the offspring of elf and mortal, Eärendil and Elwing, and Elrond, their child.
Wow.
So a little bit of a spoiler on Elrond's
Just
background.
A little
you didn't
bit.
know that.
Spoiler alert.
But yeah, exactly. But you had something here about the nature of that alliance between elves and men, right?
Yeah. I mean, the alliance itself. I mean, I love that they held themselves akin. I think that was the first thing that grabbed my mind. It was not so much just the nature of the alliance, but the fact that they were kin. But we've talked about that already. The fact that they are a biological race, a species, you know.
So they must have sort of sensed that in some kind of way.
That kinship. Here we go. I finally found what I was looking for. This was, I know, boy. So this is in Unfinished Tales. This is in the section on the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. And it looks like this was written in like around 72. So it was one of the last things he wrote, talking about the elvish strain in men, and talking about how the princely house of Dol Amroth had this special elvish strain. Legolas' mention of Nimrodel shows there was an ancient elvish port near Dol Amroth and a small settlement of Sylvan elves there from Lorien. The legend of the prince's line, and so it's a legend even in the writing, so it may not be true, The legend was that one of their earliest fathers had wedded an elf maiden. In some versions, it was indeed said to have been Nimberdil herself, but that's not probable. And in other tales, and more probably, it was one of Nimberdil's companions. And then that's the tradition we get later. The later version appears, and in this tradition, Galador was the son of Imrazor, the Númenorian, and the elven lady Mithrilis. She was one of the companions of Nimberdil among many of the elves that fled to the coast in the year 1980 of the Third Age, when evil arose in Moria. In this tale, Imrazor harbored her and took her to wife, and then when she bore him a son and a daughter, she slipped away by night and he saw her no more.
Wow.
And she was, of course, lesser elven in the sense that she was Sylvan and not Sindar, and certainly not high elf.
Right.
But that's how the Lords of Dol Amroth, that's why they were beardless.
Oh, that's right.
So, fascinating, but boy, sometimes we just chase the rabbit down the rabbit hole, don't we?
We do sometimes. But,
ladies and gentlemen, now you know we really do this show live.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now you know that we don't come into this with 8,000 pages of notes knowing exactly what we're going to say.
No, we prepare, but man, we
wing it.
We wing it sometimes. We wing it a lot. So they definitely sense that there was some kinship there, and even here at the end of this last passage, we talk about those who learned the wisdom of the Eldar became great and valiant. There's already this sense of, even this early, just by talking to the Eldar, just by learning from them, men became ennobled.
Well, we'll see that with the elf friends. As we move further into the history of men, we'll see just how important it is. The more elf-like a man is, the better he is. All the way up to Tuor.
That's true.
Probably being the most, the strongest example of that.
Yeah.
Which, of course, leads to the line of Eärendil.
Of Eärendil and Elwing and Elrond, their child.
And Elrond, yeah. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It
is. This, this is my favorite family.
Yeah. And it's been wrapped up in the story from the very beginling.
It really has been wrapped up since the very beginning. And so even though, we talk about the elves waning, we talk about, all the horrible things that have happened, there's hope on the horizon. Men are already becoming a little bit more elf-like.
Yeah.
And that's that essential optimism that we talk about so often with Tolkien's world.
Which leads eventually to the eucatastrophe.
Yeah.
Well, that, believe it or not, wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. We thank you, more so this time than ever before, perhaps, for listening to us. And we really appreciate you coming along.
Yeah, and join us again next time when we finally catch up again with our old friend Feanor as he sets foot back in Middle-earth. Did you miss us? He probably didn't. When he sets foot back on the shores of Middle-earth in Chapter 13 of The Return of the Noldor.
Of The Return of the Noldor and the cleanup of the beach barbecue. And just like with the Flight of the Noldor, Sean and I have decided to split that chapter up into 2 episodes because there's just so much going on there.
That's right. So in our next episode, we're actually going to be covering up to the chapter break on page 113 of our edition. So this is the passage that ends in, "Thus great riches came to him." So that's where we're going to stop in our next episode, but of course, don't be afraid to read ahead.
That's right. And as always, if you need cheap paperbacks to mark up, just use the links on our library page at theprancingponypodcast.com. We also have links to audiobooks and music CDs and some other cool stuff for your Tolkien collection.
That's right. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe on iTunes or Google Play Music. We need your iTunes reviews, so please leave one if you haven't. And we really, really appreciate your support. We're also on Stitcher and TuneIn. And thanks to those of you who are visiting and commenting on social media.
Big time.
Remember, yes, thank you. Remember, this is The Prancing Pony, and you can join the conversation in the common room on Facebook at The Prancing Pony Podcast or on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod.
And social media is a great place to share our podcast as well. So retweet us, share us, tell your friends. Maybe not about this episode. Just kidding. And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your questions, comments, or your passive-aggressive names for the elves to the Prancing Pony Podcast at gmail.com, and we'll try to
give them a little back.
That's right. We'll try to get them into our next episode. Well, an hour 40 is still far too short a time to spend among such admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.